Good afternoon, Southminster scholars. In pursuit of manifest destiny, our Native Americans were largely killed or forced onto reservations with less desirable land. One of these were the Sioux. In the mid-1700s, they were 25,000 strong. The Sioux Nation stretched from the big woods of Minnesota to the Rocky Mountains. It would be a Sioux tribe that would wipe out Custer at the Little Big Horn near Billings in 1869. But on December 26, 1862, the Civil War is raging. 7 years prior, 38 Dakota Sioux were hanged in Mankato, Minnesota. This would be the largest mass execution in our nation's history. How did this come to pass? Well, most people, including myself, have never heard of the Dakota conflict and the trial in 1862. The Civil War was taking center stage then, and it still does. The Dakota tribe of the Sioux had previously signed treaties ceding most of southern Minnesota and a small part of South Dakota. As you might expect, in exchange for their fertile and wooded land, the Dakota received promises of payments for 50 years, and they also were granted reservations of land along the Minnesota River. Well, these treaties led to a corrupt system of Indian agents and traders. Markups of 400% were common on goods shipped to the now dependent Indians. Furthermore, the costs of the Civil War began delaying these payments. The Dakota representatives pleaded with the Indian agents and traders to distribute needed provisions on a credit basis, but were refused. Additionally, as usually happens, the reservation lands were being seized by settlers. Violence broke out into open warfare between Indians and settlers in Minnesota. I'll let Professor Linder take it from here, but in it, watch for the massacres that occurred on both sides. When it was over, somewhere around 800 whites and an undetermined number of Indians lay dead. Watch for how the state militia were unable to put down the rebellion. Watch for Lincoln's federalizing the militia and sending in federal troops under General John Pope, fresh from his crushing defeat in the Second Battle of Bull Run. Watch for divisions among the Indians as the fighting escalated. Watch for the confusing final battle on September 23, 1862, with the capture of 269 Indians. Watch for the debate as to what to do with the Dakota prisoners. Watch for the decision to put them on trial for murder and other outrages. Watch for the trials, which came in 3 batches, conducted by the Army as military courts. Watch for additional Indians being charged and brought to trial. Watch for 303 defendants eventually being sentenced to death by hanging. Watch for the debate that arose over the conduct of the trials, their propriety, their fairness, their outcome. Watch for Lincoln's intervention and the review of the trial charges and conduct. When it was over, 38 would be convicted of rape or murder and ordered hanged. And it would be the largest public execution in U.S. history.
In my hometown of Mankato, Minnesota, between Front Street and the Minnesota River, there once stood a granite monument. The monument read simply, "Here were hanged 38 Sioux Indians, December 26, 1862. I was one of many local kids, both fascinated and horrified by a sketch of the execution scene that hangs on a wall in our county historical museum. The sketch shows a crowd gathered around a large oak scaffold. Soldiers, 1,400 according to reports, encircle the scaffold. Beyond the soldiers are thousands of spectators. The doomed Indians stand in a circle on the scaffold's platform. Each wears a white muslin covering and a noose. The sketch depicts the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. The execution marked the end of the most painful chapter in Minnesota's history, the Dakota conflict of 1862. It also marked the end of a strange legal process, one unlike one ever used before or since in this country. A process that produced nearly 400 trials, using the word trial loosely, and over 300 sentences of death. If not for the intervention of President Abraham Lincoln, these spectators gathered in Mankato would have witnessed an even grislier spectacle than they did. The execution, of course, marked the end of a chapter, not the end of the story. The Sioux Nation consisted of 25,000 strong, stretching from the big woods of Minnesota to the Rocky Mountains. The Dakota conflict trials raised many questions. Were the trials an appropriate end to a bloody conflict between a native population and a wave of settlers? When trials take place on the frontier, where no courts are operating, who should serve as judge and jury? Can we trust military officers to be impartial when they've just fought the men whose cases they will hear? Can defendants ever get a fair shake in a legal system that they don't understand, where the testimony is in a language they do not comprehend, and where no one is assigned to represent their interests? Many people have never heard of the Dakota conflict, and that's no surprise. After all, the conflict occurred in 1862, a year in which most of the nation had something else on its collective mind. Without the Civil War, the Dakota conflict might never have happened, or if it did, it might have ended more quickly. The Dakota noted that many white men of fighting age had left nearby settlements to go join the Union Army. When fighting erupted in southwestern Minnesota, the soldiers that could have quickly ended the conflict were mostly off somewhere else, fighting another war. In our search for causes of the conflict, we begin with the treaties signed in 1851 and 1858. Treaties through which the Dakotas ceded most of what is present-day southern Minnesota and a small part of South Dakota to the United States. The Dakota, as you might expect, got the raw end of the deal. In exchange for their fertile and wooded land, the Dakota received the promise of annuity payments for 50 years, plus reservations on a strip of land along the Minnesota River. The treaties created resentment in the Dakota communities. First and foremost, they had been squeezed into a small fraction of their former lands. And the settlers, with their agricultural practices, soon degraded the habitats in their traditional hunting grounds. In addition, the treaties undermined Dakota culture. Annuity payments reduced the once proud Indians to the status of dependents. They diminished the power of chieftains because payments went directly to individual Indians rather than going through the tribal structure. Equally importantly, the treaties led to a corrupt system of Indian agents and traders. Licensed traders sold goods to Indians with 100% to 400% markups. Dakota, cheated by traders, could do nothing about it. And worse, some Dakota believed rumors that the Great Father, facing the huge costs of the Civil War, was flat out broke. They worried that they wouldn't get their annuity payments at all. This last concern in particular sets the stage for the outbreak of the hostilities. In August 1862, with annuity payments running late, representatives of the starving Dakota met with traders at the Lower Agency, one of two Indian agencies along the Minnesota River. The Dakota representatives pleaded with the traders to distribute the provisions that they had in their warehouses on credit. But the traders resisted. Trader Andrew Myrick said bluntly, "So far as I am concerned, if they are hungry, let them eat grass." On August 17th, a keg containing $71,000 in gold coins arrived by stage in nearby Fort Ridgely. Officials planned to distribute the coins to Dakota the very next day. It turned out to be one day too late. Because on that very day that the coins were reaching Fort Ridgely, the event that sparked the war happened some 40 miles to the north. 4 young Dakota men, hungry and looking for food, were on a hunting excursion near a settler's homestead. The hunt took a sickening turn after the men decided to attack the homestead. When it was all over, 3 white men, 1 white woman, and a 15-year-old girl lay dead. The 4 men returned to their camp near the Lower Sioux Agency that night. Their tale caused feverish debate. The book Through Dakota Eyes includes Chief Big Eagle's account of what happened when the men visited the home of Chief Little Crow. Little Crow sat up in bed and listened to their story. He said war was now declared. Blood had been shed. The payments would be stopped. And whites would take dreadful vengeance because women had been killed. Big Eagle reported that he and others, quote, talked for peace, but no one would listen to us. And soon the cry was, kill the whites. A council was held and the war was declared. Parties formed and dashed away in the darkness to kill the settlers. In the first bloody phase of the war, under the loose direction of Little Crow, the Dakota massacred farm families. Now, to understand the intense desire of Minnesotans for swift and terrible justice in the trials that followed the conflict, we need only look at what happened in one settlement near the reservation on August 18, 1862. 15 to 20 Dakota, carrying knives and hatchets, descended on the farmhouses of Milford. At each house, they gained entry by going to the front door and asking for water. Once inside, the killing began. At one family homestead, they killed an entire family of 6, including 4 children, aged 2 to 8. The warriors disrobed the bodies of 2 of the girls, and they decapitated one of them. The attack in Milford resulted in the deaths of 53 settlers, including 20 children. Not a single Dakota warrior died in the attacks. Similar indiscriminate killing of whites occurred elsewhere. In all, an estimated 250 whites died in the first 3 days of fighting. The majority were women and children. Killing whites, the Dakota decided, was as easy as killing sheep. Now, massacre is a loaded word. I do not use it lightly. Yet by any measure, these killings by Dakota warriors were just that, massacres. To be fair, what the Dakota did to white Minnesota settlers was no different than what they often had done to their hated enemies, the Ojibwe, who occupied the forested lands just to their north and east. When Dakota went to war, they considered anyone on the other side fair game. Not all war parties, however, killed indiscriminately. Some of the Dakota chose to take women and children captive rather than killing them. Who lived and who died turned on the whims of individual warriors. The Dakota also attacked and looted the Lower Agency, home of the hated trader Andrew Myrick. Big Eagle reported that when he arrived at the agency, he found Myrick dead on the ground, his mouth stuffed with grass. The attack sent panicked settlers fleeing eastward. Whole counties on the frontier depopulated. Whites held on only in the barricaded fortifications at Fort Ridgely and the town of New Ulm. And in both the fort and the town, they were under siege. The Dakota attack on New Ulm left most of the town's buildings in ashes. 1,200 refugees, mostly women and children and wounded men, set off on foot in wagons for Mankato, 30 miles away. The initial white response to the attacks brought more tragedy. 46 officers and enlisted men set out from Fort Ridgely to suppress the attack. Ambushed along the river, just 13 returned alive. Governor Alexander Ramsey appointed Colonel Henry Sibley to lead the state militia into battle. Squads of mounted and armed men streamed towards the scene of the conflict. More tragedy ensued. Dakota warriors attacked a group of volunteers, gathering up the bodies of murdered settlers along roadsides and in homes. 20 men from the burial party and 90 of their horses died in the attack. But if phase one, this first few weeks of the conflict, went to the Dakota, the Americans decisively won phase two. The president federalized the state militia and put the troops under the command of General John Pope. Pope, fresh from his crushing defeat in the Second Battle of Bull Run, never got closer to the fighting than St. Paul's International Hotel. There he busied himself sending telegrams to Washington. He asked for additional troops and urged the extermination of what he called the wild beasts and maniacs 100 miles to the west. Meanwhile, divisions among the Dakota increased. To the north, chiefs in the upper agency region opposed the fight. Chiefs Red Iron and Standing Buffalo even threatened to fire upon any of Little Crow's warriors who entered their territory. A key fact is this: most of the 7,000 Dakota in Minnesota opposed the war from the beginning and took no part in it. On September 23rd, the Dakotas suffered heavy casualties in the Battle of Wood Lake. Dakota opposed to the war seized control of whites held captive by the warring Indians. The friendlies, as the whites called them, released 269 prisoners to the control of Colonel Sibley. Penned in now to the north and to the south, facing severe food shortages and declining morale, most of the Dakota warriors chose to surrender. The 6-week war was over, having cost the lives of between 450 and 800 whites and an undetermined number of Dakota. The question then became what to do with the Dakota prisoners. Most settlers and soldiers urged annihilation. Colonel Sibley, however, had another idea: trials. On September 28, 1862, Sibley appointed a 5-member military commission to try summarily Dakota and mixed bloods for murder and other outrages. Whether Sibley had such authority to appoint a commission is questionable, but he seemed to have acted with good intentions. Without quick trials by a commission, the prisoners would almost certainly have been the victims of vigilante justice. The commission convened in a nearby military tent. The first order of business was to identify both witnesses and potential defendants. Reverend Stephen Riggs, who worked for 25 years as a missionary with the Dakota and served as a chaplain for Sibley's military expedition, proved to be an invaluable asset. He spoke the Dakota language, and his Dakota parishioners trusted him. By enlisting their help, Riggs effectively served as a one-man grand jury. To understand the final outcome of these trials, we need to distinguish between two types of violence. Some Dakota participated in massacres, and in a couple of instances, rapes. Other Dakota participated only in battles, such as the siege of Fort Ridgely or the 2 assaults on New Ulm. Though you could argue about whether an assault on a town defended by local residents is truly a battle. Generally, we do not think of warriors or soldiers who participate only in battlefield actions as murderers. That is what warriors do. On the other hand, we usually treat the indiscriminate killing of civilians differently, consider it a war crime, punishable under the law. The trials, and there were 392 in all, came in 3 batches. First up in the first batch was Joseph Godfrey, the son of a French-Canadian father and an African-American mother. He faced charges of, quote, killing 7 white women and children, more or less peaceful citizens of the United States. Unlike most criminal trials, where the prosecution presents its case first, the court called Godfrey himself as the first witness. Going first is worst. It locks in testimony and opens up the defendant to countercharges from people he implicates. Godfrey, in what the trial recorder described as a voice of most marvelous sweetness, testified that he was mowing hay when approached on horseback by a gun-toting Dakota warrior. Apparently, the warrior did not know what to make of the dark-skinned Godfrey. With his gun cocked, the warrior told Godfrey the Dakota were out to kill whites. In Godfrey's words, he asked me which way I would go. Godfrey claimed he decided to go with the Indians out of duress. I have my wife and children I didn't want killed. Godfrey and the warrior joined up with a large group of Indians at a creek about a mile from Godfrey's house. And there the warriors insisted that Godfrey change from pants into breechcloth and put on war paint. Godfrey joined in various battles and in massacres, and he testified about all of them. He provided detail. For example, he told the court that at one settler's house, his war party found the table set for a family dinner. Spying the table, a warrior told Godfrey, "After we kill, we'll have dinner." Godfrey named names. For example, he identified a Dakota who knifed an old man and then cut him all to pieces. He named another who shot a woman and then kicked and killed her children. The question for the military commission was whether Godfrey acted as a willing participant or whether he did what he did just to save his own life. Godfrey admitted driving wagons for the Dakota warriors. He admitted seizing horses. He admitted being present at massacres. He even admitted firing shots in the assault on New Ulm. But the one thing that Godfrey did not admit to was murder. Godfrey claimed to have been always a reluctant warrior. 6 prosecution witnesses testified against Godfrey. They included a woman held captive by the Dakota who described Godfrey as whooping around and happy with the Indians. Another former captive testified, "He appeared to me to be with the Indians and to act as they did." Most damningly, the father of a mixed-race friend testified that Godfrey bragged about killing 7 men. "He never told me he was forced into it." The military commission voted to sentence Godfrey to death. At the same time, however, they cited his valuable testimony and information in their recommended commutation of his sentence to imprisonment for 10 years. None of the other 300-plus defendants the commission was sentenced to death received such a recommendation. The pace of trials sped up after Godfrey's troubling case. In the first batch of 29 trials, most prisoners received death sentences, but 6 received acquittals. The commission was not just a conviction mill. It insisted on at least some credible evidence of guilt before convicting. On the other hand, we should observe that the bar for conviction was low. Consider, for example, that the last batch of 253 trials took place over 10 days. Now, that's a rate of more than 25 trials per day. Soldiers escorted the defendants into court in manacled pairs, 8 at a time. Now, how could the trials move so quickly? Well, essentially, it's because for the commission, mere participation in a battle justified a death sentence. In about 2/3 of the total cases, prisoners admitted firing shots. And you can imagine why. They simply did not understand that their admissions could cost them their lives. In all these cases, the commission proceeded to a guilty verdict in a matter of minutes. In doing so, the commission was merely following orders. Colonel Sibley directed judges, once they were satisfied the defendant had voluntarily participated in the war, to convict, and to convict on double quick time. General Pope, who would review the commission's verdicts, also made no secret of his feelings. He declared that any Dakota should be executed who was guilty of any sort of complicity in the late outrages. Dead settlers cannot testify. Most of the whites who survived the war had fled the area. The best witnesses for the prosecution turned out to be Joseph Godfrey and other so-called mixed breeds, to use the terminology of the era, who joined the forces with the Dakota under varying degrees of duress. Godfrey alone gave evidence in 55 cases and was single-handedly responsible for dozens of convictions. Recorder and judge advocate Isaac Hurd called Godfrey the greatest institution of the commission. Godfrey's testimony hurt most defendants, but it helped others. For example, when the commission tried a mixed-race person named Thomas Robertson, Godfrey testified, "I don't think Tom was a bad man. I believe he was forced to go." In another case involving a Dakota warrior named Chankata, Godfrey testified that when other Indians wanted to kill a white woman, this Indian saved her. In a third case, Godfrey testified that the defendant always gave good advice. He told the Indians that they should not cut the whites' heads off. In fact, in dozens of these trials, Godfrey played the role of a quasi-prosecutor. As Isaac Hurd put it, quote, "When a prisoner would state he was innocent, and Godfrey knew he was guilty, he would drop his head upon his breast and convulse with a fit of musical laughter." Hurd explained that when the commission asked Godfrey to talk to the defendant, he would often force the Indian, by a series of questions in his own language, into an admission of truth. Consider trial number 366, the trial of a Dakota named Hay P. Hay P, in his testimony, claimed to have had a lame arm at the time of the raids. He told the court that his gun was defective and could not fire. Then Godfrey took over. "Why don't you tell the court the truth?" he asked. "I saw you go and take the gun of an Indian who was killed and fire 2 shots, and then you borrowed mine and shot with it." Faced with Godfrey's accusations, Hay P backed down. "It is true what Godfrey says," he admitted. The commission sentenced Hay P to death. Remarkably, not a single defendant offered an alibi after Godfrey placed them at the scene of a shooting. Not a single defendant claimed that Godfrey had identified the wrong man. In the end, the commission sentenced 303 defendants to be hanged by the neck until dead. 20 defendants got prison terms of 1 to 5 years. The commission found the remainder of the Indians not guilty. Let us consider briefly the fairness or lack of fairness of these trials. This was a one-of-a-kind set of trials. The usual protections of the criminal procedure that are available to defendants in civil courts were not enjoyed here. They didn't apply. The Dakota had no defense lawyers. They had no one in their corner who could cross-examine prosecution witnesses. No one to track down alibi witnesses. The commission could even convict defendants when a member or two entertained reasonable doubts. Convictions sometimes turned on the testimony of a single witness, a witness who might not even have been present when the alleged crime occurred. Moreover, this was not the most impartial of juries. The military members of the commission might have been men of integrity, yet they were also military men. Some of these defendants had recently attacked the troops under their own supervision, troops whose lives they had sought to protect. Finally, we can ask whether the commission was wrong to treat the defendants as common criminals. Numerous historians have argued that military officials should have instead treated the Dakota as legitimate belligerents of a sovereign power. On the other hand, only a minority of Dakota fought in this war, and some of what they did was a far cry from normal warfare. Defendants were not the only people for whom the trials were unfair. These were homicide trials without sheriffs, detectives, or coroners, trials in which witnesses rarely mentioned the names, ages, and apparent causes of death of victims. One could argue that the Dakota trials were unfair to the victims who were not identified, not even enumerated. So let's agree that the trials were unfair. Would it have been reasonable to expect better? After all, this was the frontier. No courthouses around. In the middle of a whole state, it seemed, that was calling for Dakota blood. When the trial record arrived, General Pope wasted no time in approving all the sentences. He rejected the commission's request for mercy for Joseph Godfrey. Ultimately, however, the decision as to which of the condemned prisoners would live and which would die rested with one man, President Abraham Lincoln. General Pope told anyone who would listen that he was sure the president would swiftly approve all of the sentences. Lincoln, however, had other ideas. The president sent a telegram to General Pope asking that he forward as soon as possible the full and complete record of their convictions. As the Civil War raged, Lincoln pondered the fate of 303 Dakota. Aware of rumors that many of the convicted men had raped white women, Lincoln ordered two White House lawyers, George Whiting and Francis Ruggles, to make a careful examination of the transcripts and identify those proved guilty of violating females. The aides found exactly 2 convicted rapists among the 303 condemned men. Minnesotans would demand more blood than that, knowing that a decision to permit the execution of only 2 men would almost certainly lead to a mass lynching of the prisoners. Lincoln gave his lawyers a second order. This time, Lincoln said, "Screen for those convicted of rape or murder as distinguished from those convicted only for their participation in battles." The distinction that the Commission and General Pope refused to make, and probably should have made, Lincoln made for them. This second review produced 40 names, and the lawyers provided Lincoln with a summary of the proof against each man. Whiting and Ruggles, however, made no point of mentioning the Commission's recommendation for mercy for one of the 40, Joseph Godfrey. In early December, the president considered his aides' summaries and the transcripts. Then he wrote an execution order listing the name of each Dakota defendant and his trial number. Lincoln's handwritten list included 39 names. Joseph Godfrey would live. So in the end would one other defendant, who was reprieved at the 11th hour. The final toll would be 38. In his report to the Senate, Lincoln explained his decision. He was, he wrote, anxious to not act with so much clemency as to encourage another outbreak, nor with so much severity as to be real cruelty. On a sunny December morning in Mankato, the 38 condemned men walked to the gallows with dignity. They sang death songs in unison as they climbed the scaffold stairs. At the signal of 3 drum beats, a survivor of the massacre swung an axe. The swing cut the rope that supported the platform on which the Dakotas stood with nooses around their necks. The platform dropped. For a moment, the crowd was silent. Then a loud huzzah rose from the estimated 5,000 spectators. Soldiers buried the Dakota bodies in a mass grave near the Minnesota River. At nightfall, a local doctor came to collect cadavers from the site. The doctor was William Mayo, the father of 2 physicians who founded the Mayo Clinic. Little Crow, the chief who led the warriors into battle, was not among the executed. He fled after the fighting to present-day North Dakota. In June of 1863, however, he returned to Minnesota, and in July he was picking berries with his son when a settler shot and killed him. But even beyond all this loss of life, we should note one other tragic consequence of the Dakota conflict. In April of 1863, Congress enacted a law providing for the forcible removal from Minnesota of all Sioux. The conflict continued. Only in 1890, in Wounded Knee, South Dakota, did the generation of warfare finally end. In my hometown today, the old granite monument is gone. In its place is a large limestone statue of a bison. The site of the 1862 execution has been renamed Reconciliation Park. Each December, scores of members of the Crow Creek Sioux tribe ride on horseback from their South Dakota reservation to Mankato to commemorate the mass hanging. Many non-Indians, some with ancestors who died in the Dakota War, join them. When I consider the Dakota trials, my thoughts keep turning to Abraham Lincoln and to a visitor he hosted in the White House in the fall of 1862. Lincoln's visitor was Henry Whipple, the Episcopal Bishop of Minnesota. Whipple pushed Lincoln to champion more just and humane treatment of Indians. We can assume that Whipple talked with Lincoln about the Dakota trials. He probably influenced Lincoln's decision to spare so many lives. Of this meeting, Lincoln said that Whipple, quote, talked with me about the rascality of this Indian business until I felt it down to my boots. Lincoln suggested that once the Civil War was over, he would make better treatment for Indians a priority. Lincoln's comments leave us wondering, if not for a bullet from John Wilkes Booth, how much different, how much better might have been the history of U.S.-Indian relations.
A few takeaways for me. The military trials marked both the beginning and the end of a strange legal process, one unlike any used in the U.S. before or since. It also demonstrates Lincoln's ability to keep his eye on more than the Civil War crisis itself. I got thinking that the Civil War alone would have consumed and crushed lesser leaders than Lincoln. But the executions were not the end of the story. In 1863, Congress enacted legislation for the forcible removal of all Sioux from the Minnesota area and westward. The efforts of settlers to gain control of the Black Hills, that then became part of Sioux lands, when gold was discovered, is what led to Custer's demise in 1869. Subsequent military expeditions would continue on until 1890, when the remaining Sioux would be crushed into submission. It would be later memorialized in a 1970 bestseller that many of you are acquainted with, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. One of the great ifs of history is how Reconstruction of the South under Lincoln might have been different and better, but so too our treatment of the remaining Native Americans. Might that have been different and better had Lincoln lived? But perhaps the lesson here is that while manifest destiny was inevitable, it was accomplished at the expense of our Native Americans who had been here for thousands of years. Well, comments, observations, run me down. Next week, the Lincoln assassination conspiracy trial, and as always, thanks for coming.